Today we're remaking one of our oldest videos, as our original coverage of Golbat and Crobat's competitive history was released in October 2017, and for some perspective, this is a month before Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon came out. We decided it was high time for an update before Crobat decides to unleash vengeance on the mean, rainy streets of Gotham, by which we mean the False Swipe Gaming offices. We're jumping right into Bat Country as we ask, how great were Golbat and Crobat actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Gen 1 Golbat is one of the worst fully evolved Pokemon to ever exist. It has no merit whatsoever, meager stats, no move pool at all. Seriously, this is a Pokemon with base 80 attack that primarily did damage with Double Edge, which is only 100 base power in Gen 1. And of course, it's worse than useless typing with major weaknesses to Psychic, Ice, Electric, and Rock, while neutral moves bowled it over as well, and its resists were useless, with the exception of an Earthquake immunity. But seeing as every Pokemon that used Earthquake would also pummel it with other moves, and the fact that Golbat, couldn't do anything in return, meant that even its Earthquake immunity was, in effect, also useless. Honestly, you could even take away all its weaknesses, and it'd still be utterly worthless. Golbat was so unbelievably bad, we're not going to waste any more time on it than we have to, and instead are jumping right ahead to how Game Freak attempted to rectify their mistake in Gen 2 by gifting Golbat its evolution, Crobat. This was also beneficial for Golbat itself, in that its newfound status as a not fully evolved Pokemon, or NFE, meant it was no longer expected to have a competitive niche, which in Gen 2, it didn't. Crobat was a significant boost thanks to its general stat upgrade. It was bulkier and stronger. This is not to say it was bulky and strong in general, but it was a far sight better than Golbat in this regard. The main boost, though, was how it went from Golbat's decent 90 base speed to a stunning base 130, a towering benchmark that became its signature, as it had for fellow base 130s Jolteon, Aerodactyl, and Mewtwo. Crobat was now one of the fastest Pokemon in the game. It wasn't going to be touching OU by any means, but it was still quite decent in UU. The bulked out nature of Gen 2, with max EVs in every stat, meant Crobat couldn't use that speed as effectively to slice and dice as it would become known for in later gens, especially because it still struggled to do direct damage. Gen 2 had introduced superb Poison Stab and Sludge Bomb, but for some unearthly reason, Crobat just didn't get it. Its best stab was thus Wing Attack, which thankfully was buffed to a 60 base power after the paltry 35 it had been in Gen 1. And though it wasn't much for doing major damage, Wing Attack was still an incredibly useful stab because it enabled Crobat in one of its most important niches, which was being UU's single best counters to a Pokemon famously short on them, Swords Dance Scyther, the most threatening Pokemon in the tier. Crobat was generally a great answer to Swords Dancers, strange though that may seem for a Pokemon without especially impressive physical bulk. It was a complete and perfect answer to Victory Bell, while also excelling against Pinsir and stuffing Blossom to boot. Crobat even went a step beyond countering Swords Dance. It was used to counter Belly Drum. Belly Drum Quagsire with an agility baton pass to it was one of the most frightening Pokemon in the tier, in many cases an instant game ender. Crobat's immense speed meant it outran Quagsire even after an agility, but what did it do in return? Haze, that's what. Goodbye Belly Drum boost, and agility boost for that matter. Crobat was a baton pass team's worst enemy, thoroughly ruinous to their efforts. Now, good as it was at doing its job, Crobat was far from a metagame superstar because it leaned passive when it wasn't countering these Pokemon. Obviously, to counter such a wide, dangerous berth of threats was incredible, but it could also be frustrated when it offered little into much else. Beyond trying to make things happen with Thief, Toxic, or even Confuse Ray, yeah, that sparse move pool was rough. Sludge Bomb would have really been a boon, but still Crobat was an important, uniquely useful Pokemon in Gen 2 UU. In the Gen 3 OU we know today, Crobat is and always was completely useless and utterly outclassed. However, before Gen 3 OU took final form with all 386 Pokemon, it existed in what was known as the 200 metagame, named for the 200 Pokemon available when Ruby and Sapphire were the only games released. In this lost relic of a metagame, Crobat was excellent, and here's the context. In the 200 era, OU's most dangerous defining threat was Alakazam, with incredible speed that outsped just about everything and let it wield that outrageous special attack to fully go to town on teams late game. All sorts of unusual anti-Zam strategies popped up. For instance, Zangoose Stab Silk Scarf boosted Quick Attack, but at least Zangoose was an actually decent Pokemon. Swellow, on the other hand, was thoroughly mediocre, yet was used because it actually outran Alakazam and could function as a much weaker Choice Band Dodrio. Well, if that worked, why not Crobat? As it turned out, Swellow was completely eclipsed, and Choice Band Crobat became popular popular as a Zam revenge killer and genuinely decent threat in its own right. Now that it packed Sludge Bomb, it had an excellent stab that not only packed solid power, but had a superb 30% poison rate. Plus, Alakazam wasn't the only major threat running around that Crobat could answer. Another terror was Heracross and its dual stabs, both of which were not just resisted, but quadruple resisted by Crobat. And of course, its quad-effective stab Aerial Ace obliterated Heracross in return. Beyond checking these two as well, Crobat was generally able to find its way into battle and pose quite a fair threat between its power, poison rate, and coverage options when paired with Magneton to remove Skarmory. And its speed was tremendous against more than just Alakazam too. It was so fast, it outsped Dragon Dance Gyarados after a boost, acting like a choice scarfer from later gens. Now, sometimes Crobat had a bit of trouble breaking through tankier teams, as Metagross and Dusclops generally did quite well against it. Crobat wasn't completely stifled by them though, with Hidden Power Ground and Shadow Ball respectively. And really, it wasn't supposed to be effortlessly through them anyway. Its job was just to keep Zam in check, and given how Alakazam answers were in such a short supply, this was an immeasurably important role. Plus, Crobat was generally quite a solid physical threat. Its power let it act as a solid revenge killer to many offensive threats, like the aforementioned Zangoose, and it could cause quite a bit of disruption within the opponent's physical stopping ranks, as you couldn't switch in Swampert or safely intimidate it with Salamence or Gyarados, since Sludge Bomb's poison would ruin them. But sadly, Crobat fell off alongside many other 200 staples from Alakazam to Zangoose, as the full Pokedex brought about by the release of Fire Red and Leaf Green. Alakazam itself was a lesser combined threat in this era of Jirachi, Celebi, Suicune, and Raikou, and was completely trounced by the newly added Tyranitar. Plus, even if you did need an Alakazam revenge killer, you'd go with the equally fast Aerodactyl, whose typing and power made it infinitely superior, and a metagame-defining staple. Crobat thus completely disappeared. It was too much for Yu, getting relegated to borderline, which was some consolation. Ultimately though, Gen 3 Crobat was a legitimate OU threat during a metagame that has disappeared to time, and it's a shame because Ruby Sapphire 200 was a fascinating tier. It can be summed up with the closing words from In the Mood for Love. That era has passed. Nothing that belongs to it exists anymore. Meanwhile, Golbat actually found its first viability ever with the eventual emergence of the NU tier. It fit right in among the low base stat totals populating the meta, many of which came from other not fully evolved Pokemon, and had two main niches. First, with Choice Band, it could act as a mini Crobat. Its quadruple fighting resist and flying stab was excellent in letting it act as a check to the tier's single best Pokemon, Hitmonchan, and it turned this defensive utility into an opportunity to pepper the opponent with poison-happy Sludge Bomb, barring the necessity of using HP Ground to ward off Maw while switching. Its last slot went to Giga Drain, and yes, the idea of a Choice Band Pokemon with a base 65 special attack using a move that at time had a mere 60 base power seems both hilarious and depressing, but number one, Golbat wasn't exactly overflowing with options, and number two, Giga Drain was useful to threaten Relicanth and Graveler more effectively than even Banded Hidden Power Ground. Though yes, the prospect of being choice locked into such a Giga Drain was sufficiently bleak that some players preferred Shadow Ball to hit Chimecho harder instead. When not banded, Golbat adopted a utility set focused on bulk, longevity, and status spread, being able to switch into Hitmonchan more reliably, while supplementing its natural Sludge Bomb poisoning with the more direct approach of Toxic, sometimes ramping things up with Protect, and sometimes adding Spike Shuffling to the mix with Whirlwind. Depending on the set, Golbat was an excellent choice for aggressive offense and balanced defense alike. It wonderfully blended defensive utility with proactive counterattacks. Gen 4 was a generation for Crobat, as throughout Diamond and Pearl, it was a popular OU choice as the fastest sleeper around, since its previously terrible Hypnosis had been buffed to a solid workable 70%. Now this would go away with the move's reversion to its original 60% in Platinum, but that's where Crobat also gained the Heat Wave that would allow some workability to its special attacking set that was now possible thanks to the physical special split, making Sludge Bomb a special move. But that wouldn't have been possible had it not been for the inclusion of a major boosting move, Nasty Plot. Still, Special Crobat was an afterthought even after getting Heat Wave. Most of what made it so appealing in this fully fledged power creep new OU had been available right from the beginning. Yes, it now had to contend with the obnoxious Stealth Rock weakness, but look at the incredible tools it got that now fully turned it into a Swiss Army knife of utility that it has become so known for. Reliable recovery in Roost, genuinely strong physical stab in Brave Bird, and a switch move in U-Turn. These three moves alongside the utility stifling of Taunt coming off of a Pokemon tied for the highest natural speed stat around made Crobat an excellent offbeat choice. It took a while for it to take off in OU though. Post-Hypnosis nerf, it was overlooked for a while. So before we explore how it did in Standard, we'll dip down to the UU tier that Crobat made its home for a while, but not for long, because Crobat completely warped the metagame around it. It ran circles around the tier. You couldn't even wall it safely with something like Registeel or Rhyperior, because you know what Crobat could do? Super Fang. Bam! There goes half of your health. Easy pickings for its teammates. Crobat switched in with absurd ease, effortlessly countering then UU staple threats like Roserade, Shaman, and Yanmega, and proceeded to harass everything that cared to switch in. The fact that it had such good synergy with Dugtrio and Pursuit Trappers made it even more obnoxious to deal with. Yeah, you might have an answer to Crobat, but you were one U-turn away from not having that answer anymore. Plus, these elements basically took the place of Super Fang, thus letting it fully wield its standard Brave Bird, Taunt, U-turn, Roost set. That was an immensely popular lead, ruthlessly effective at keeping rocks out the field with Taunt, making it even more of a pain to deal with. Alternatively, it could also drop Taunt and U-turn to run a vicious sub-Roost set. Crobat was so popular and so good that it single-handedly kept two otherwise broken Pokemon in check in the aforementioned Shaman and Yanmega. Crobat was put up for a suspect test but avoided the banhammer, and then people realized that Crobat wasn't just a Shaman counter, it was a Shaman partner. You could U-turn out of just about every Crobat answer and bam, there was Shaman, ready to terrorize the opponent. The Crobat-Shaman duo completely took over UU, with balanced teams abusing them becoming the dominant style. Here's how unstoppable Crobat was. Its Stealth Rock denying talents were so great, it anchored the most iconic, successful balanced team of the era, with both Moltres and Honchkrow and no Rapid Spinner. Assisted further by Shaman, of course. 3 Stealth Rock weeks including a quad week, this would have been extreme even with the spinner, but nope, Crobat transcended the need for spin. It was put up for a suspect test again, and this time there was no mistake. It got the banhammer. Funnily enough, after Crobat was banned from UU, Shaman and Yanmega followed. Eventually, Crobat's OU talents were recognized, and it emerged as a tournament-worthy choice on balanced teams. Originating on a team wielded by French players that was renowned for popularizing Abomasnow on teams that weren't all-out hail abuse with Wall Rain, Crobat eventually expanded its reach to be included on more standard Spikes balance teams. It's shown in the past Latimen's metagame for how viciously it shut down the grass types that had become popular in the wake of the Dragons bans. One was a familiar face from UU, Shaman, and the other was the detested mushroom, Breloom, whose secondary stab Crobat also quad resisted. Speaking of fighting types, Crobat wasn't just good into grasses, it was a great lead because of how it completely dominated the lead Machamp that had itself completely dominated the lead metagame. Overall, Crobat was like Gliscor's more flawed but much faster cousin. Like Gliscor, Taunt and Roost let Crobat act as a superb stall breaker against the dominant teams of the time, while even packing an advantage in the form of its toxic immunity. And since the standard Gliscor set at the time was Taunt Toxic, Crobat completely dominated Gliscor one-on-one. Of course, its main appeal was that enormous speed, letting it get the jump on offense. Being able to outrun Dragonite's Gyarados and Dragonite was excellent, but even if it chose to lower its speed so as to trade this in favor of more bulk EVs, it was still getting the jump on so many major targets, both Choice Scarf and Dragonite's Tyranitar, Starmie, Gengar, and Infernape, the latter two being famously difficult to check for balance. Crobat being so fast meant that even when it wasn't hard countering something, it was still finding its way into battle and generally being a pain for opponents. It was a solid offbeat choice that saw serious tournament success. Now, it took a hit over time when spinning became more difficult and Pokemon like Defensive Jirachi became more popular, but it always had its place. Overall, Gen 4 was an amazing one for Crobat. Meanwhile, Golbat was completely useless in this new, stronger NU. Crobat was without an OU niche in the 5th generation, but it made up for this by returning to UU and utterly excelling there. It wasn't broken, but it was an elite presence in a metagame in large part defined by its large swaths of fighting-type offense, and it was so good at this that it thrived even though it commonly went without rapid spin support. It stuffed the Mean Shao and Heracross that so dominated. The latter was especially important since, after gaining Moxie, Scarf Heracross was the scariest cleaner in the tier, and yet Crobat was completely unimpressed by both stabs. Of course, it had to be careful around Stone Edge, but nobody wanted to be spamming that with their Scarf Heracross, given how it tended to thud into just about everything else. Crobat also ruined Scrafty, which it outsped even after a Dragon Dance. Indeed, it was so much faster than everything else that it didn't need that much speed investment, leaving it free to invest in both bulk and attack, lending its Brave Bird a solid sting. This actually helped make it a better Scrafty check too, guaranteeing that it'd be able to KO it after Stealth Rock. It could also go further in one direction or another while still being good at both. For instance, it could max out HP while still hitting hard, or max out attack while still being tanky. Crobat went beyond answering the tier's myriad fighters too. It further supported the claim that Gen 5 UU was similar to Gen 4 OU with how it shut down Roserade and Shaman. It once again generally ran circles around the opponent with Taunt, U-turn, and Roost, making answering it a generally awkward dance no matter what your answer was. Made especially irritating given how easily Crobat entered against so many common important Pokemon. It was itself a staple, anchoring many a bulky offense team with crucial defensive utility without bogging the team down as a more passive wall would. Crobat shut down opposing offense and did so in a way that generated its own. It also, once again, delighted in taunting stall teams. It could really make things awkward for opponents by mixing things up a little, trading in U-turn, which it didn't want to spam too much without Magic Bounce or Rapid Spin support, for either Toxic, which would utterly ruin a Rhyperior or Zapdos thinking that they're safe, or the more immediate, all-encompassing hit of Super Fang. Generation 5 also introduced Eviolite, and thus Golbat had a niche in NU again. NU's Stealth Rock Crisis meant it was difficult to use, given it was constantly fending off its weakness to the Sneaky Pebbles, and unlike Crobat, it didn't even have Black Sludge recovery to slightly assuage the problem. But generally, it was somewhat evened out by the fact that everything else was getting plagued by rocks as well. Generally, Mandibuzz was better, but Golbat had two crucial advantages that let it eke out its place in the tier, however small. First, it was Toxic Immune, meaning it had more leeway switching in against bulkier stuff, crucial for its toxic antics. Second, and more importantly, its quadruple fighting resistance meant it was able to absorb one of the most frightening attacks in the tier, Sock's Choice Band Close Combat. Mandibuzz matched up better against the metagame overall, and Golbat erred too much on the passive side to be a consistent choice, but it did have its niche. Crobat had some interesting tools for the doubles format. Its amazing speed was as useful as ever, not just in the way it could soft check practically everything in one form or another thanks to the power of Flying Gem acrobatics, as well as with the many utility moves it offered a team, but in 2012 it most commonly offered Tailwind support, and with such high speed, it was going to be very difficult to stop, especially because its inner focus ability guarded against Fake Out, meaning it didn't need to slot a move slot or in battle turn to protect. If not Tailwind speed control, its fast taunt was always valuable, but the real nasty weapon was of course Super Fang, whose halving of a target's HP could very quickly put them into KO range for a teammate. Opponents had to be extremely cautious to not have Crobat and its partner gang up on a Pokemon to eliminate it before it could do anything. It wasn't the most spammable Pokemon, as its bulk wasn't too impressive in the face of weather-abusing threats, but it certainly had a niche. Most notably, Samuel Harzma used Crobat to reach 7th at the Fort Wayne Regionals, and in 2013, Jordan Bradley reached 3rd at the Australian Nationals, fully demonstrating the bat's potential. Gen 6 brought two massive changes for Crobat and Golbat. Number one, the Defog buff giving them further help with Stealth Rock, and since they had Defog themselves, they would often be the Defogger on their team. Number two, there were now Fairy types running around, and their Poison typing was newly valuable in thwarting them. Crobat returned to UU, where it was elite once again. Right away, XY UU saw it establish its standard role as Defog support with its wicked speed, as well as a superb defensive profile. In addition to shutting down the tier's go-to Fairy type, Florges, it also took on its old familiar Heracross once again. Crobat could also take advantage of the Defog buff in another way, as its huge speed and taunt can now be used to block opposing Defogs. This concept was taken to an extreme on a team that reintroduced spikes to the tier. How could one even use spikes in the world of Defog? They wondered in OU and UU alike. In UU, the answer was shutting down Defog by using taunt at every corner, and Crobat was now a major part of that. If it could shut down Stealth Rockers in Gen 4 UU, it could shut down Defoggers now too. Crobat continued its excellence, even though at times it had to go with a set its user dreaded being forced into. One of the lamest necessary evils of all time, itemless Crobat. This was a genuine set because it was imperative to not take full powered knockoffs when using it to check Mega Beedrill, which Crobat was otherwise a great check to. At least you got an automatic full powered acrobatics out of it, but you would rather have Brave Bird's extra power and deal with the recoil through Black Sludge. This neutered Crobat wouldn't last though, as number one, there were way better ways of dealing with Mega Beedrill, which also had a tough time in a metagame so dominated by Aerodactyl. And number two, its utility was so vast that you wanted all the recovery on it you could get. The metagame shifted into one dominated by Conkeldurr, which was incredibly broken. Crobat's anti-fighting properties helped it a lot there. But eventually Conkeldurr was banned, and Crobat was still elite. The player base realized just how much was enabled by Crobat. In fact, the metagame's defining team style, Balance, was anchored largely around Crobat and its synergy with other staples like Seismitoad and Empoleon. The latter also being able to defog meant Crobat's moveset would be freed from having to use the move, and was thus able to function at its most threatening. The Crobat Empoleon Seismitoad trio, or even just the Crobat Empoleon duo, was so effective that it basically turned the metagame into a bunch of mirrors of such cores. Throw in your favorite Pokemon, Florges, Omega, a flavor Pokemon, whatever, you had the freedom to do so because when anchored by Crobat, Balance was so good, there was almost no reason not to use it. It provided by far the greatest consistency in being able to play around just about everything. With Crobat's incredible blend of defensive typing, utility, and speed, it checks so much. The dangerous Virizion, the brutal Nasty Plot Celebi, the annoying Assault Vest Mienshao, oh you mean the things that provide opportunities for Crobat to Super Fang and U-turn all over the place? Plus with Crobat's new Infiltrator ability, even substitutes were rendered useless. Nothing escaped its reach. Crobat could even take on defog duties almost without missing a beat. Then again, those Pokemon also functioned beautifully alongside Crobat, because who wouldn't want this Pokemon that was able to slice and dice in every matchup imaginable? Jokingly outlandish comparisons were made to Gen 2 Snorlax, but seriously, Crobat was making a serious argument for itself as one of the very best Pokemon in the tier. It landed in the top 3 and then in the top 2, and finally it was undisputed. Crobat was the #1 Pokemon in Gen 6 UU. It really was perfectly suited to the meta. Players were even using Rocky Helmet on it to really hammer home its punishing of fighters and Dubblade, and even Scarf Hydreigon's U-turn. Crobat did it all and made Gen 2 UU its dominion. And with the importance of defog, Golbat actually moved up to RU, which was a metagame similarly dominated by Balance, except more slow-paced on average. Now it was terrified of losing its Eviolite to the newly buffed and spammed knockoff, but ultimately, this was unavoidable when switching into Hitmonlee and Sock. The fact that Golbat tended to function so well even when regularly robbed of its Eviolite was impressive. Its general passivity was obnoxiously exploitable, especially without even its boosted bulk to help, but it was a necessary evil, albeit an effective one in spite of its flaws. Unlike most passive Pokemon though, Golbat had one advantage preventing it from being taken advantage of too badly. You couldn't stifle it with Substitute thanks to Infiltrator. This made it an excellent Toxic spammer, especially since Gen 6 also introduced the mechanic where poison types could never miss Toxic. Golbat was a flawed specific Pokemon, but it was an important part of the Gen 6 RU landscape nonetheless. Crobat returned to VGC, Fake Out immunity in tow, and with a newly valuable Fairy Resist. Its utility was nice, but then again, it was now living in a world of Talonflame, whose lack of Fake Out immunity was more than made up for by its other metagame defining traits. As such, Crobat's placements were quite limited. In 2014, Jacob Hardenbauer reached 45th and Jackson Hambrick reached 35th at the US Nationals. In 2015, Evan Ferrari reached 7th at the Oregon Regionals and Riccardo Rispoli reached 8th at the Italian Nationals. But in 2016, Crobat's niche opened up. The restricted Pokemon were capable of sweeping at a moment's notice, thus making every turn crucial. As such, Crobat's Fake Out immunity was huge, given how popular Mega Kangaskhan was. But even more than that, it was able to act as a check to Xerneas with its access to Haze. Goodbye Geomancy boost. With Lunberry and Taunt, it also shut down Smeargle's Scarf Dark Voids. Being able to take on the Smeargle-Xerneas duel was simply incredible, considering how dominant they were. Crobat could also wield Quick Guard to superb priority blocking effect. Meanwhile, Tailwind and Super Fang were amazing support for Crobat's own restricted partners like Primal Groudon. As such, Crobat saw a great deal of usage and success, with its most notable placements being Alistair Sandover at first place at the Perth Regionals. Though interestingly, Sam Pendelis brought Crobat to the Australian Nationals and was also the highest placing Crobat user at Worlds, coming in 15th. As such, Crobat was well and truly a bona fide pick in the 2016 VGC season. Power creep, you say? That's cool and all, but even Megas and Z-moves together couldn't stop Crobat from returning to UU for the third consecutive generation. It has to be said though, not only was it not as good this time around, it wasn't nearly as good. In fact, it wound up being pretty mediocre, considered by some to even be outright bad. Its speed tier remained excellent, and in many ways it resembled its Gen 4 OU variant, with how it checked Gengar and Infernape, especially with Infiltrator bypassing Gengar Substitute, while also taking on Nasty Plot Celebi and generally being a pain for offense. offense if it used Flynium Z to be able to burst huge damage for a likely KO against other major threats in Latias and Terrakion. Plus with Taunt, Roost, and Super Fang, it was potentially a major irritation for stall teams. And remember, Yu was so bombarded by stall that it eventually wound up taking tiering action against it. There was a time where Crobat was genuinely very good in the tier. With Mega Venusaur running around, answers were in short supply, and that's when Crobat, always the perfect anti-grass Pokemon, swooped down to stifle it like just about nothing else could. Crobat was also stellar for warding off Breloom when it hit the tier. However, both those grasses were banned, and Crobat was left largely without a niche. But against these broken Pokemon, it was amazing. Against the rest of the tier, its low attack stat and unimpressive bulk were left on display in a tier that just got stronger and stronger. Plus, Crobat struggled with competition. It was a poison type that didn't beat Dragon Dance Mega Altaria, and there were other better flyers like Moltres, which was preferred for its general offensive excellence as well as being able to counter Scizor. Heck, even Gligar, which often lost its Eviolite, wound up being better than Crobat. Its immunity ability meant it no longer had to fear Toxic either. Ultimately, Crobat was okay, but only just okay. Still, to survive this long in UU was an achievement, even though the RU player base was begging for its usage to drop because they wanted it for their own tier, where it no doubt would have excelled. Golbat, on the other hand, went back to its original home of NU, where it once again performed its Eviolite defog role, persisting in spite of its perpetual fear of knockoff, whose reality it came to terms with on quite a consistent basis. It had quite an impressive list of fighting, fairy, and grass Pokemon it took on. Even if it didn't hard counter something, simply helping its team play around it was in many cases sufficient. Passimian, Pangoro, Sceptile, Whimsicott, Comfey, and many others, Golbat tended to fall into the category of passive blob, the dread of all defensive Pokemon, but in spite of its unremarkable nature, it was crucial for it to simply do its defogging duty, and that it did well. Crobat returned to VGC in 2019 for the Sun, Moon, and Ultra Series, once again brandishing its unique blend of utility backed by its incredible speed in these formats with restricted Pokemon, with safety goggles or Focus Sash as its items this time around, seeing as it no longer needed Lumberry in the wake of Gen 7's Dark Void nerf. Sash being especially helpful to ensure Tailwind setup against something like Scarf Tapu Lele. Crobat set out to Super Fang as much as it could, Tailwinding and taunting when appropriate, and of course hazing Xerneas like a college frat jock enjoying power over a freshman, all the while unable to be flinched thanks to its inner focus, or as the kids would say, now it locked in. As such, it had a lot of usage, so we've limited its placements to first placers. But also, thank you to Joseph Ugarte for filling us in on how it was used in 2019. Ashton Cox placed top 2 multiple times with Crobat at the Memphis Regionals, Sao Paulo Internationals, and San Diego Regionals. Yoko Taguma reached first at the Kuala Lumpur Regionals in the Moon Series, and Marco Silva reached first place at the Sweden Regionals. Crobat completely fell off by Worlds as it did not place top 16 at all, but it has already made its mark as VGC-wise, Crobat came out to play when the most broken Pokemon were around, and there it thrived. Crobat rejoined proceedings in the Crown Tundra DLC and dropped further than it ever had before. Not to RU, as had previously been desired, but all the way to NU. This was more than a bit much for a Pokemon that previously made its trade excelling in UU and was now in a world where there were not only no Megas or Z-moves, but where it didn't even have to worry about Stealth Rock anymore thanks to heavy-duty boots. It didn't just excel, it became effectively mandatory because of how it towered over everything. It also helped that it outsped and checked fellow broken bat Noivern. This didn't last though, and it wasn't because Crobat got banned. It was because it was simultaneously being used in RU and was recognized as so excellent there that its usage wound up lifting it out of NU naturally. It was one of the very best Pokemon in RU as well, once again taking up the mantle of packing the tier's highest unboosted speed stat, while its defensive profile, now boosted by boots, was more consistent than ever, letting it reliably fulfill its role of answering several of the most important Pokemon around like Mimikyu and familiar faces in Roserade, and once again, Heracross. Additionally, it was a major pain to switch into with Taunt backing Brave Bird, since it would shut down recovery from would-be hit takers like Umbreon, and it was an excellent defogger since it naturally dominated the spikers. In addition to the aforementioned Rose and Heracross, the latter also having gained spikes this gen, it shut down Golisopod too. As a bonus, even Nasty Plot Crobat was genuinely good now, able to turn the tables on many would-be answers. For instance, Rhyperior got completely decked by a +2 Giga Drain. A major change though was that Gen 8 had gifted Crobat Hurricane, and this was a tremendous stab to have it at +2, blowing away Flygon that thought itself safe. It wasn't just that Crobat was running Nasty Plot that was surprising either, but that the Nasty Plot set itself had so many surprises in store. For instance, a Nasty Plot Roost set just completely sat on Milotic and Umbreon, letting Crobat beat them down reliably, while Heat Wave was always good to ruin steals. And of course, Sludge Bomb and its poison rate were ever so reliable. Whichever set Crobat wound up running though, it was one of the very best Pokemon in Gen 8 RU, and had a serious argument for being the best outright. And that still wasn't all. It took a while for its talents to be recognized, but Crobat eventually became an amazing part of UU. It never rose to the tier through usage, but any serious UU player recognized its talents. As always, its tremendous speed was a wonderful demonstration of the theorem that going first is almost everything. Being able to outspeed the major UU benchmark of base 115 was critical, given how notoriously threatening Zygarde 10% and Azelf were. It was particularly nice that Crobat didn't just outspeed them, but outsped them by a mile, meaning it hardly needed max speed investment, letting it play around with his EVs, packing both bulk and power. As always, Crobat wasn't just a defensive check to these Pokemon, as well as being able to irritate the daylights out of the fighters, Conkeldurr, Cobalion, and Keldeo. It was incredibly irritating to answer in its own right. Brave Bird could be stopped by bulky Pokemon like Hippowdon and Skarmory, sure, but they were pure taunt fodder. Crobat wasn't without competition though. As a bulky flyer, it had to fight the tier's excellent standard, Salamence, for a slot. And yes, the speed was huge, but Noivern also got the jump on these targets while being able to actually switch into Keldeo's Water Staff, and was a great Pokemon in its own right. However, in spite of such great competition, Crobat was still a great choice and established itself as a genuinely good choice in UU. Funnily enough, probably better than it had been in Generation 7. And as for Golbat, Golbat was too passive even for PU this time around, but at least it wasn't untiered thanks to its not fully evolved status. And with that, now we can answer the question, how great were Crobat and Golbat actually? Well, the answer is Crobat was a superb Pokemon. It's been UU viable, or too good for UU in literally every generation since its inception in Gold and Silver. And as for VGC, any Pokemon that is needed to stifle some of the strongest Pokemon of all time is great. And Crobat is one of those. Talk about withstanding power creep. Plus, even Golbat had its place in the lowest tier across several gens. Not bad for what was originally one of the worst Pokemon in the game. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos.